Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about the first season of one of my all-time favorite reality TV shows. Around 10 years after its initial release, I'll be talking about The Genius, with the first season here being titled Rules of the Game, a South Korean reality TV show which really blew me away upon my initial viewing of it, far exceeding the typical tropes of reality television, innovating upon the genre in a number of ways, from its really flashy editing to the use of flashbacks and flash forwards that elevate its storytelling, the addition of an in-game currency that allows for more options in how the players approach the game, all while the game itself still being that of a standard reality show, but just executing almost every aspect of it near perfectly, with fantastic casting, with not a single dud on this cast, despite the fact that it is essentially a cast of celebrities, which you typically would expect to not really care about the game itself, and then being only there to boost their reputations. And while there are minor instances of that here, it never ends up negatively affecting the season. We also have this main and death matches that are made in a way to encourage backstabbing and are deceptively simple. But with out-of-the-box thinking, we see these players exploiting the rules to get the upper hand. We see these players exploiting the rules to get an upper hand, which these players seem to do at every single opportunity. And it is watching this after having watched the likes of The Genius Netherlands, which uses games from seasons 1 and season 2 of the South Korean show, and for them to play out in the most baseline way there, it really made me appreciate how good and how special this original Korean version of the show is, with its cast just always looking beyond the easy solution. And despite the praise I'm giving to this season at this point, this is debatably my least favorite season of The Genius, which really just shows you the sheer quality of The Genius as a whole, with all 4 seasons probably being in my top 10 reality TV seasons of all time. Again, I really just love The Genius as a series, and like my other retrospectives, I'll be running through the season from beginning to end. So let's start off with the premiere, which starts right away with this mysterious delivery of a package, only for it to be opened by Kim Gura, who, from what I understand, was the biggest celebrity here, while Sungyu debatably becomes that after the fact. Kim Gura was supposedly like the big star here, and was someone that I know is pretty prominent on other South Korean shows, though also I know he's pretty controversial, as he's well known for making misogynistic comments, which might get referenced later in this season. But either way, you could tell that the productions really highlighted him here, seemingly due to his inherent popularity. But this is followed by us getting shots of the remaining players also getting their invitations. Sangmin instantly being a standout here, just walking through the airport with this package dressed in a black cloak. And we later seeing him really ham it up while reading the invitation, which again is a great introduction to what is debatably the best character in reality TV history. But also here we do hear the Genius's tagline for the first time of beautiful defeats and ugly victories, which is not particularly catchy, but really the overall tone of this scene really gives off this cool, mysterious vibe to the show that shows you its stylistic nature right off the bat. But this opening scene concludes with Yoonji being shown to be the last to enter, and we get this notable shot of the camera panning around the room as we get shots of each of the players all wearing black outside of Yoonji, and this obviously feels extremely scripted, which I find funny that this is immediately followed by Gura calling out how scripted this feels, giving us this first instance of the show's sense of humor, where unlike other reality shows, the players in The Genius never seem to take things personally, with there always being light banter between players at all times, and that really being highlighted on the show, and the editors playing into that, which again mixing this more playful comedic editing style with the more aggressive strategic gameplay, both in its cast but also in the editing. It's able to merge these two tones pretty perfectly, that adds to the uniqueness of The Genius's identity. Now, another thing I should mention is the use of music within The Genius, which is really just brilliantly used across this show, where it does use a lot of licensed music that I am very much confused on the legality of the songs that they are using, which I believe is due to the very wonky Korean copyright laws, but this does end up greatly adding to the show's identity, with songs like Extreme Ways and Freedom sticking to my mind more so from The Genius than it does from the actual movies that they came from. But following this, we do get a more detailed introduction to the players, showing us clips of the players' backgrounds, with again, all of them having some sort of claim to fame. And this show does a really great job at giving you insight into Korean pop culture, with the show constantly making references to these players' careers, and sometimes their backgrounds playing into their season storyline, where we see the likes of Sungyu, who is this young pop star, and in turn everyone ends up underestimating him, only for us to get the reveal that he was second in his class, clearly highlighting him as someone that is much smarter than he appears. We have Jinho, a professional StarCraft player, typically known for getting second place, which that aspect of his career is constantly brought up across this season and plays into his season-long arc. But also here we see Poong's fandom of Sangmin, which has Poong working with the likes of Sangmin and Gura early on here, seemingly just due to the fact that he has fans of them, which ends up being an interesting aspect of the genius as well. But finally we do get introduced to Bandage Man, the host of the show, who is literally just a still image on screen that reveals the games and the results, and again, this adds to the mysterious tone of the show, though really isn't a major highlight. Though outside of that, we do get 3 dealers that are there in person and do handle the in-person interactions with the players, where they become a constant across the 4 seasons to where they become characters in their own right. But also the show does have a narrator, though does do an effective job at explaining some of the more strategic moves being made across the season, with the show also using charts to visualize what is going on. Well, this is also where we do get the introduction to the rules of the game, where we get introduced to the concept of garnets, again, this in-game currency that can be used in whatever way the players see fit, and can be used at points to buy advantages in the game as well, but also ends up being representative of the prize pool, with each garnet in the game equating to 1 million won, where the winner of the show gets the equivalent of all the garnets in the game. And with the winner of the death match also getting garnets from those that they beat, and the winners of the main match typically getting garnets through winning as well, it does open up a wide range of ways for the players to use these garnets to their benefit. But then we proceed to see the game structure, where every round until the final will consist of a main match and a death match. The main match is a game where everyone competes, and the winner of that match will be given immunity, while the loser will instantly go into the death match and pick a non-immune player to face off against, with the death match being a one-on-one game, where the loser will end up getting eliminated. Now, if there is a sole winner of the main match, that winner will divvy out immunity to another non-losing player, which in itself here is an interesting addition to the game, with this now adding a reason for 2 players to work together to have only one of them win, as that person can then make their ally safe as well. Though obviously adds risks for the non-winning player, as if it turns out that there is a tie, there will be no other immunity divvied out, but also you have to make sure that you're not in last, as that would put you in the elimination anyway. Though at the same time, you can be tied for last in this situation, where if there are multiple players tied for last, the winner or winners then get to decide who is the sole loser, the one that is going to the deathmatch for sure, which all this adds social strategy aspects to the game. But really the base structure here is actually a pretty generic reality TV game structure. It's actually not that dissimilar from the format of the challenge, just swapping out physical challenges for more strategy-based challenges. The matches themselves, for the most part, are extremely well designed here, where mixing that in with the strength of the cast, it does lead to a lot of these matches still be entertaining to watch, with again the players making the most out of the rules that they are given, and really that makes this show rarely feel bloated, despite the fact that it does have lengthy episode run times, with episodes running over an hour, which is typically an issue for me, but it just really isn't with the Genius for whatever reason. After the explanation of the game format, we do finally get Gura once again undercutting the show by saying this game feels very abstract, which I don't even fully understand what he even meant by that, but it is funny how the show can make fun of itself in these situations. But this is followed up by the reveal of the first main match, that being the 1-2-3 game, which is an extremely simple one compared to what we would see later, though ends up being a pretty perfect game to introduce us to the Genius, being a game focused around forming alliances, but also gives you opportunities to screw over your fellow players in order to secure the win, where here every player is given out 3 cards of each value in 1, 2, and 3, and they have to face off against an opponent to use their cards and get points. And the person with the most points by the end of it wins, though if you have cards left over, your points will be eradicated, and with 13 people in the game, there will always be someone guaranteed to have a card left over with an odd number of cards, meaning that someone will always get 0 points, which again essentially forces you to at least make a duo to avoid that fate. And again, this game ends up playing out in a near perfect way, where we could have easily just seen all these duos get together and leave one person out, but we get so much more intermingling here, and I love the way that this episode is structured as well, going from group to group and showing you the evolving strategies as the strategy continues to get more and more complex as we go through each different group. But after the rules are announced, we get our first flash forward, which again is a unique aspect of the show, though I'll be honest, I don't love the flash forward, especially as much as I like the flash back, as it rarely fails to lead to interesting TV, with it obviously usually being this big reveal. Though with the flash forward, it ends up spoiling things that are going to happen later, which while they do their best to try to not actually spoil anything, it does still leave it in your head that this event is eventually going to happen, which ends up lessening the intrigue moving forward, even though its purpose is to make it more interesting in the sense that it's trying to make you think of how could that situation happen, but instead I think it has the opposite effect. And I think there are also points where flash forward seems to just be entirely pointless, seeming to be there just because that's the precedent that Genius has set. So again, I'm not a big fan of them as a whole, though here it's a decent one where it does show chaos erupting after Minseo has been betrayed and Yuji telling her who did it, which they end up bleeping out the name here, though really it doesn't end up being that interesting of a reveal anyway. But returning to the present, we end up seeing Jimmy Cha instantly being looked at as this leader figure, with him revealing that this is very simple, which ends up being his catchphrase. But finally, whenever Jimmy Cha says that he's figured out a game, it typically means that he's realized the basic strategy for the game, which we then proceed to see other people out strategize him later. And also here, he's telling the strategy to the entire group, which essentially makes it really pointless, as at that point everyone can counter his strategy. And also, again, his strategy is the most basic one here, where it does guarantee you safety, as he plans on essentially having an alliance give each other 3 wins. Again, making sure that you don't have 0, but it doesn't really put you in a position to elevate beyond that. But right away, it has become known that creating an even number alliance is the optimal strat for this game. Strangely, something that they didn't figure out in the Genius Netherlands until it was too late. But right away, we do get a lot of focus on Sungyu, with Sungyu being someone that everyone wants to work with the assumption being that he is clueless and will just follow orders. And instantly we see him make bonds with Kyungran, Jinho, and Sangmin, which ironically ends up being the final 4. But this relationship with Sangmin ends up being a major one across this season, with them starting to bond over being musicians, and Sangmin end up acting as a mentor figure for him, even though their relationship gets pretty rocky at points. But following this, we do see Sangmin and Gura come together, who end up forming a powerful duo early on in this game, and they end up pulling in Pung because he's a fan of theirs, I guess. But they finally make this alliance right in front of the others, openly strategizing and pulling each other away at points, really having no level of subtlety in how they approach the game here. And we do get a lot of them really hamming it up too when they're playing their cards, pretending like they don't know what's going on, to which no one ends up believing them, which we do even have people laughing at them in the background. Now we do follow that up with focusing on Changyap and Jungwoon, who are 2 of the more under-edited figures in this premiere, but here we see them create a strategy to get 4 wins, already surpassing Jimmy Cha. But then we cut to Jinho and Junsuk, where we see them initially form a 6-win strategy, only for them to follow that up with the realization that they can gift cards to each other, and in turn end up with winning 9 times, which would have been the optimal outcome for them here, with us not seeing anyone else plan for beyond 6, but almost instantly we see Jinho messing this plan up by using his 3s against Pung and Yurim, losing 2 of his 3s and essentially nullifying that plan right from the start. But also in essence showing us the story of Jinho, where he's a player that is very good at the strategic aspects of the game, but is still very prone to mistakes, with this episode really highlighting that, which in itself being an interesting aspect of the Genius here, and Jinho obviously ending up being the winner of the season. But despite that, there isn't really a winner's edit for him until around the midway point in the season, where he ends up really coming off as a bumbling idiot for a lot of the early portions of the season. And a large reason for that is because there really can't be a winner edit on the Genius, where these episodes are only filmed around 5 weeks in advance, meaning that the season hasn't finished filming by the point this episode airs, which we later see referred to down the road, which again is an interesting aspect of the show to allow the players themselves to see the televised first few episodes by the end of the season, which has never really affected the gameplay, though again conceptually is an interesting aspect of it. But to add to Jinho's idiocy here, we do see him leaving his garnet behind after a talk with Junsuk, to which we see Sangmin notice it and proceed to pick it up, which I wonder if that'll be relevant later on. But the main relationship that ends up affecting the results of the game here ends up being the Sungyu-Minseo alliance, where we have them starting the 3-win strategy, though to Minseo's detriment, where she ends up giving Sungyu all 3 of his points first. Then when it is her turn to get her points, he decides to stop, just openly betraying her there, which is where we do get the reveal that he was actually already in an alliance at the time that Minseo approached him having one with Kyungran, and that it was Kyungran that convinced him to back out of this deal with her. Which Kyungran's betrayal across this premiere in particular is a pretty villainous one, despite her not really doing anything wrong here. I mean, she's just simply got Sungyu to be loyal to an alliance that they made first anyway. Yet here we get a lot of talk about how she's scary and intimidating, which has always felt very gendered to me. But following this, it's pretty inevitable that Minseo is going to be the loser, though we do get some intrigue here from us now finding out that Sungyu is all of a sudden in first, due to him getting points from both Minseo and his OG alliance, leading to regret from Junsuk and Jinho about not going all in on their 9-win strategy, where they say they didn't do it because they didn't think it would be enough, which I really don't get how they thought that would be the case, but this really makes them come off even more doofusy here. But now the talk ends up turning to wanting someone to tie Sungyu so that he can't end up giving immunity away to his accomplice. To which Gura, being Gura, thinks that this is a dumb idea and ends up calling all the women clueless, which again shows his misogynistic tendencies, with Yoonji in particular voicing her annoyances there. But this is where we do get the reveal that Gura has been in on the plan all along, with his group from earlier having merged with the Sungyu, Kyungran, and Jimmy Cha group to form a 6-person alliance, which actually feels like kind of a waste of a 6-person alliance here, as they end up just playing the basic strategy of getting 3 points for everybody, where they really could have just optimized the path for one of them to win, where they could have just backed one particular player and in turn they would be far and away ahead. But either way, we then go back to Minseo, who now plans to give a point to Jinho so that he can be tied for first place alongside Sungyu, which I do think this is good work from Minseo, opening up her options for when she has to pick her opponent, but also gaining an ally in Jinho just in case she does survive, and it really ends up playing into her favor later in the episode. But then we finally catch up to the flash forward with Minseo learning about Kyungran being behind Sungyu's win, and we do see Kyungran doing a bit of damage control, though it always came off as a bit awkward. But this is where we do see Sangmin telling Gura that they have something to work with, which ends up being another instance of foreshadowing. By the way, Minseo does end up giving Jinho the extra point just in the nick of time after an attempt from Gura to stall her. And the show does leave this up to be a surprise for when the results are announced. But again, for a second there, a bad look for Jinho, making it look like he had been tricked into losing all of his points. But again, it does go through here. But this is where we get a bit of a surprise, where Minseo decides to pick Junsuk as her deathmatch opponent, which really comes out of left field, where while we did get some talk earlier in the episode about how Junsuk's a threat, it never seemed to be properly set up of why Minseo picked him personally. Now, I think the assumption is that Sangmin told her to when giving her the garnet, but again, it's not really properly explained here. By the way, we do learn that the deathmatch ends up being Winning Streak, a game that I am very mixed on, as it is essentially a social strategy game, where you have to convince your fellow players to lose to you in rock, paper, scissors, though this also ends up adding in an element of luck to it, with the order being random, and you need to have the longest streak of wins. Now, the social strategy elements here I can take or leave, as obviously I am a massive fan of social strategy games, though I do also understand the criticism that this isn't what the genius is, so I can understand why people don't like that aspect of the deathmatch. But really, the randomness of it all really is the death knell for me, where it really just feels like an unnecessary element of luck to add to the game here. But really, that element of luck is largely erased in this scenario, because here we get to see everyone agree to give Jinho the deciding vote, with him being the closest to the two, which is actually pretty cruel to make him be the one to make that decision, though obviously later we find out the real reason for this, with it obviously being under Sangmin's guidance, along with the fact that we also see Sangmin getting Jinho and Mincio to talk one-on-one, and it is here where we see Mincio give him a garnet to incentivize him to keep her, and everything ends up going according to plan here, where outside of Poong trying to tie it up for a round just to see what would happen, it does end up being passed down to Jinho, who has the final choice here between Junsuk, his number one ally from the main match, or Mincio, who gave him a win and a garnet. And here he does decide to vote out Junsuk, which does come off as a bit of a surprise during your initial viewing, though it does seem pretty clear that everyone just immediately was sketched out by Junsuk, with even Jinho saying that he would have been a tough foe later on. And really a nice touch that I do like here is that during these eliminations, we do hear from the narrator, where he talks about the reason why the eliminated player lost, which is essentially teaching you the game in a season called Rules of the Game. Which again, I do like that minor aspect of it here, but also here we do see the screen flash that there will be a huge twist revealed shortly, which is where we cut to Sangmin'S Confessional, who had been noticeably not as present in this episode as you would expect him to be considering how big of a character he seemed, which is where we get the reveal from him that he was the one behind saving Mincio, and we also get Jinho talking about how he lost a garnet, which takes us to the flashback, the first big reveal in the history of the show, where we get this flashback of Sangmin stealing Jinho's garnet once again, only for him to follow that up with handing it to Mincio, telling her to use it as leverage, with Mincio essentially convincing Jinho to save her by just handing back his original garnet. Being this fantastic reveal, showing Jinho as this doofusy figure once again, while also being a breakout moment for Sangmin, who really becomes the king of these style of reveals moving forward, while also showing you how the genius will play with your expectations. Again, being a reality show with this non-linear storytelling, which leads to this premiere ending with a splash here. But before moving on, let's talk about Junsuk, who we will see back for Grand Final, where he does end up proving himself to be a really capable player there, but it just seemed like he had a massive target on his back on this season from the very beginning, though even here he did demonstrate a pretty good strategic mind, with him being the only one to formulate this 9-win strategy. The problem is that he didn't fully go through with it, though I do think this one appearance here is largely a fluke, especially considering his strength in death matches that we do see more of in Grand Final. That makes me think that had this not been a death match that was so social strategy focused, he probably would have survived here. But with that, let's jump into episode 2, which is where we do see the what would be standard intro to the episode, where we see the players re-entering the set in groups, and there you get to talk about the previous week's events, essentially acting as the previously on segment, but doing it in a way that allows for more time with this cast, essentially serving as downtime where we get to see more of their personalities, with this occurring before the next main match is even announced. This brings up another unique aspect of the genius in that, unlike most other reality TV competition shows, these players aren't living together and instead go home and live their normal lives for a week, only for them to reconvene for 1 day a week, probably factoring into why these players don't take the game as personally, as they're still grounded within reality. Though this does also add some interesting possibilities for out-of-the-game relationships and alliances to form, though considering the main matches vary, this does rarely have an effect on the game. But interestingly, during the initial discussions, we do see Jinho finding out about what happened in the previous round, where he sees that Mincio has 2 garnets instead of 1, which leads to Sangmin revealing the plan, and in turn, Jinho talks about wanting to get his revenge, which feels like foreshadowing, even though it isn't, as again, they didn't know the results of the season by this point. But then we learn about what the second main match is, that being the election game. Another pretty simple one, and another one with a lot of social strategy influences here, with the winner being the person to remain in the election and get the most votes from their fellow players. A basic concept, and really could lead to a boring main match if a simple majority just came together, but once again, this cast excels beyond this simple game, with this being another episode that showcases how unique of a show The Genius is, with the entire episode making you think that a certain group is getting their way, only for us the viewer to be blindsided alongside that group in the reveal that another group has outplayed them the entire time. Though an interesting aspect of this game is the inclusion of chips, where every player is given 20 chips to divvy out, with them being exchanged for garnets if they were to win, adding additional garnets to bargain with here, with that playing a major role in how this game plays out. But following this, we do immediately see Gura and Sangmin walk off to the side to scheme, which ends up being foreshadowing to the future reveal, with this being the only time we see Gura strategizing in this episode before the eventual flashback sequence, as every other time we see him, he's just sitting in a room, making appearances as if he's doing nothing, when in reality he had already had the game set by that point. But we already see Poong's connection to the Gura alliance, causing him to be looked at as sketchy, while also we see him talk about wanting to work with Jinho, which these combining concepts do end up leading to Poong's later flip. But here we get the flash forward for the episode showing the written promise from the death match, where this one really does not add much to the episode here, but beyond this, once again, Jimmy Chaw ends up saying he knows how to win this game, talking about all you need to do is spend all your chips, which I mean, obviously, and he talks about how if he wanted to, he could win. Again, a really bad look for Cha by the end of this episode, with him looking like a buffoon here, just saying the obvious and looking very cocky, despite the fact that he's eventually one of those blindsided. But eventually registration opens up with everyone but Kyungran and Cha end up joining, which don't understand why they didn't, considering they didn't have a plan at this point. Well, again, the other group already had the game sewn up. But really, we spend a lot of this episode focusing around Jinho and his attempts to put together a majority alliance, being so confident that the other side doesn't have the numbers yet. And we even see Changyop trying to signal to him that Poong is not on his side, and Jinho instantly turns that notion down. We see Minseo trying to give Jinho advice on how to hand out his chips, though she obviously knows by that point that he's pretty much doomed, which the fact that Minseo is so convincing in her playing up to this minority alliance ends up being a really suboptimal play for her, making her take a lot of the brunt of the blame when that other side feels blindsided and they need someone to obviously go into the death match. But eventually we do see Jinho and Urim joining forces, with Jinho's plan now to get Urim the win. And again, the overconfidence from Jinho's side here gets really ridiculous, with Jinho being genuinely confused over what numbers Gura thinks he has, even though the red flags were there, with Gura openly talking about how he has a plan that will blow their minds, and also the fact that suspiciously all of Gura's chips are gone. It does make you wonder how they didn't recognize something was wrong here. But before the vote reveal, we do get a few notable moments that I want to talk about. One is the fact that this episode does strangely get the start of the Changyop Jungmoon showmance that never felt like it was a thing, though the show tries to pretend like it was. But also here we get a good chunk of content from Sungyu, with him still being fun and confessional, where after a segment showcasing his and Sangmin's relationship, he talks about only trusting him 2%. And also we get some fun from the players hamming it up while resigning, with Sangmin obviously doing his thing there, but Sungyu as well, with them embracing afterwards and Sungyu saying, "I will always follow you," which was funny. But also we do get shock when Gura ends up resigning here, which in turn only leaves Changyop and Urim up for the election, when Changyop is supposed to be in Jinho's alliance and even goes to the lengths of pretending to resign at the last second only not to, which ends up being the moment that we get the flashback, completely recontextualizing this entire episode, where we see that Gura and Sangmin at the very beginning had agreed to back Changyop, and that Gura and Changyop had swapped chips, meaning that the chips that Gura had been distributing were really Changyop's the entire time, with the majority of those involved getting 3 chips in order to go along with this plan, while Yoonji was promised immunity, as we see happen. But also, we see that all this happened a full hour before the game properly began, essentially being instantly after the rules were explained, once again really showing you just how out of the loop the other side were. But here we also get the vote result, where it turns out to be 8-4 for Changyop, with Jinho, Urim, Kyungran, and Cha being blindsided, and instantly there is confusion over if it was Kyungran or Minseo that flipped, with Jinho instantly thinking it was Kyungran due to her sketchy moment earlier of her not even knowing which candidate they were supposed to be backing. But this does lead to a fun moment of Kyungran overhearing Jinho while she was in a confessional, leading to her leaving it and confronting him, and again, that was fun. But again, this all ends up being poor play from Minseo, where she continues to lie to the group, despite the fact that she ends up being outed by the point that the Garnet count is revealed, which makes her an obvious pick for Urim to take into a death match, which ends up being the return of Winning Streak, a terrible choice to have a social strategy based death match after a social strategy based main match, and you would assume that Urim would be screwed in this situation, though we do see her being able to turn the tide here. where we do get a lot of focus around the two making deals for garnets, and really considering how the majority didn't even seem to be that solid and were willing to do whatever for garnets, and the fact that Urim had that minority alliance solid on her side, it does become pretty clear that Urim had the advantage, with her only not getting Gura on her side, who was first anyway, while Mincio loses almost instantly with Jungmoon sealing her fate, with Mincio clearly not being looked at as a trustworthy figure in the game and seemed to be largely expendable to most people. But once again, we get text on the screen that a huge twist will be revealed, which doesn't end up being nearly as impactful as the previous one, where again it does show us the context around that written promise, with Sangmin making her promise to give him 2 garnets, which again, fine, it's certainly no garnet heist, but again with that we lose Mincio, who I think was an interesting figure across these first 2 episodes, also getting a decent amount of screen time considering her placement in the death matches both times, and through that she had some decent play, particularly with how she played Jinho in the previous round, though also had some sloppy play as we saw in this episode. I mean, she isn't entirely a bad player, but one that didn't seem to know when to drop the act, as her continuous lying both put a target on her back from that minority, but also potentially sketched out the figures within her own majority, to where it didn't seem like she had the social relationships to recover, but again is still a player that seemed to have some level of game ability here. But now let's jump into episode 3, which ends up being the worst episode of the season in my eyes, and really debatably of the entire series, with a really boring main match and death match, though there is some minor emotional weight to it that probably elevates it above the all-time worst. But right away the target does seem to be firmly placed on Gura and his alliance, with him spending the entire episode on the outs. But following talk of this, Sangmin walks in and obviously now wants to get his garnets as he was promised in the previous episode, leading to a humorous segment of Urim having to give away all the garnets she had just won. But this is also the point where, again, really early on in the episode here, we get the first flash forward, seeing Kyungran crying and thinking that she wouldn't cry over something like this, which is another one that gets very spoilery by the end of the episode, though here it does make you think that potentially Kyungran could be in danger. But here we learn about the third main match, that being Abundance and Famine, a game that I've always disliked, with it somehow being too simple but also too complicated at the same time. Being the first of these style of games that we would continue to see more of across the show's history, with this one involving having to secretly pick between Abundance and Famine, each with its number of bread allocated to it, and each player is given a certain amount of tickets to use, and which one they pick between Abundance and Famine determines how much bread they get. The really detrimental aspect of this game, though, is the fact that if too many people go to either side, then no one gets points. And again, after these 2 really simple games in the first 2 episodes, this one instantly comes off as more complicated, though one that is also just, again, poorly designed, where once a majority alliance forms and pulls together their resources, they will almost always win this game and could easily just ice out those on the outside, through them just piling all their tickets on both ends, as we see happen here. But right away we do see Gura up to his old tricks, with him pulling away Sangmin and talking to him in front of everybody once again. But this time we do see Gura having the wrong read and thinking that having a minority alliance is the way to go, as they will always get the spoils, but that just ends up backfiring on him here. But this is also where we get more focus on Pung, who, despite having worked alongside Gura in the last 2 episodes, does decide to flip against him here, with Jinho instantly trusting him, which gives us a flashback to last week where Pung betrayed Jinho, and also we see Jinho having blind faith in Pung when he's talking to Gura, which again, all this is not a good look for him, really showing his naivety, but Pung does end up genuinely flipping here after Gura refuses to work with Jinho, and in turn severs ties with Gura, ruining his relationship with him for the rest of the season. But also here securing his alliance with Jinho, with them working in lockstep until his boot round, with this being one of the few instances that out of the game relationships play a major factor in the game. But also while here we do see Jimmy Cha coming up with his typical strategy for the round, where he wants everyone to work together until the final round to guarantee the addition of garnets to the prize pool, which again puts a lot of trust into the other players, and here we instantly see Gura not being on board with this plan, and we see him trying to rally the troops against it, which ends up being ineffective, though we once again get an overconfident Cha with him talking about how the game has already been decided, and while he is technically right, he does clearly underestimate the likes of Gura in this situation. But this is where we do get the reveal of Cha's master plan, where again he figures out that this supermajority can use all their resources to make sure there's no way the other side can get any points. And once this plan is formulated, there isn't much suspense to the rest of the match, with this plan clearly going through, and we get a lot of focus on the outsider point of view, with them trying to spy in on conversations and them slowly realizing that Poong has turned against them. But eventually we do see Kyungran and Sangmin being the only ones to get points, with Kyungran being in the lead, meaning that she is essentially guaranteed to win here, making you question the flash forward. But of course they have to give us a new one here, this one being really egregious of them showing Sungyu in the deathmatch, making it seem like Kyungran was crying over him, though that's clearly not the case. So this one essentially spoils that whoever goes against Kyungran goes home, with that being someone close to Kyungran, but also that Sungyu somehow finds his way into the deathmatch in a situation where this takes away all the suspense from the choice to put him in later in the episode, making it clear that Kyungran's obviously going to pick him. But before that, we do get to a bit of intrigue in the fact that Cha, being Cha, had actually miscounted, meaning that they are short on tickets, but this all amounts to nothing with the reveal that they can buy tickets with garnets, which really just saps all the suspense out again. And again, it is an addition here that helps out the majority, though it is the first time that we do see advantages being bought with garnets, though again, this ends up being an underwhelming use of it. But Kyungran does win the main match here, with everyone but Sangmin being tied for last, which gives Kyungran the sole vote on who to put into the deathmatch, which as spoiled, she puts in Sungyu, interestingly due to worry that Gura is too strong. But here we get to the faux pas of this entire plan from the majority's point of view, where now with Sungyu in the deathmatch, he gets the choice of who to go against, meaning that a member of this majority was always guaranteed to be going into the deathmatch anyway, with him blindsiding the majority here and picking Jimmy Cha, showing Cha's own plan backfiring on him here, which feels pretty apt considering his run on the season. But then we get to the worst aspect of this episode, and that is the deathmatch here, which ends up being Tactical Yutenori, which is a play on a traditional Korean board game, and this is probably the most boring possible deathmatch, where it really just drags on, feeling like a game that takes forever to play and is also just not entertaining to watch. And somehow they end up using it 3 times across this season. But they try to switch it up here by having the players have to pick partners and other players can bet on the results, and these are nice little additions, though it doesn't make this entertaining in any significant way. But here we do see Cha picking Jinho, while Sungyu picks Sangmin, of course, where Sangmin doesn't know what he's doing. And we do get the great line of, if we are truly musicians, we should make a move. But Sungyu wins here, and it's pretty clear after Cha's loss that that's obviously why we get the Kyungran crying scene. Though again, after Sungyu picked Cha and Kyungran was seen crying, it essentially spoiled that Cha was getting eliminated right from the get-go. And Cha's a fun character across this season, not a good player, one that seemed to have a basic grasp on any of the games that they were playing, but never seemed to look beyond that, though did seem to be a person instantly thrust into the leadership position, and did really relish in that, though through that made him a target, despite having a decent chunk of allies that wanted to keep him around. Though the fact that he was so misguided in his leadership did lead to some interesting TV here, with him being portrayed in a bit of a doofusy way, and while I do think most of the episode ends up being lackluster here, I do think the best part of it is this downfall for Cha, where his own short-sightedness causes him to be vulnerable while he is such a prime target for the opposite side, which feels like a pretty fitting end for him. Now let's jump to episode 4, which once again starts with talk about Gura running the game, and that he is now working with all of the guys except for Jinho, really propelling this Jinho-Gura rivalry we'll see in a few episodes. But then we find out that the 4th main match is going to be Zombie Game, which teeters back to having a more simple main match here. This one being more of a social deduction game, with 2 players being randomly picked to be zombies and those having to infect all the other players, where every player has to touch another person at least once per round, but also each player gets a cure that can only be used within 10 minutes of the touch. An additional cure can be bought for a steep 5 garnets, which again kind of saps some suspense from the episode later, but this is a game that is extremely difficult for a zombie to win here, as again they have to turn everybody. And with the constant reveals of how many humans and zombies are left in the game, it really makes it easy to deduce who the zombies are. Though for the humans, if they do touch a fellow human, they get a point, and the human with the most points ends up winning, which overall I did find this to be a pretty fun game, though again a pretty poorly designed one. But I think the fact that the cast, mind you, a pretty poorly designed one, but I think one that really is excelled by how the cast ends up playing it here. Though right away, it never felt like the zombies had much of a chance, especially considering how everyone accurately figures out the zombies pretty early on here. Though we do get a lot of fun along the way. Though right away we are told two of the humans, seeing that Kyungran and Sangmin are humans, which I did find to be a curious choice. I do think it would have been more suspenseful had we just not known any of the roles, at least for a little while, though obviously I get why they made this choice, as they want us to have these POV characters for us to use as guides, though I do think the Sangmin choice in particular was one that took out a lot of fun possibilities, as with Sangmin just being Sangmin, the uncertainty of whether or not he is a zombie could have led to really fun TV, though it did feel like they mostly showed his role here for the flash forward, where in the flash forward, we see Sangmin frantically running around trying to find a cure, which, I mean, it does for sure add to the suspense that we know that Sangmin is a human and that something will go wrong, though still a bit mixed over how this was utilized. But again, right away, we do see everyone suspecting Jungmoon as a zombie, which is where we do get her notable line of saying, "I am a woman," when talking to Changyop, which they use to really hype up this fomance. Which the relationship between the two becomes a major focus of this episode, and we do see them touch only for Changyop to use his cure, but following this we do get the reveal that she is a zombie, and with Sangmin having suspicions on Gura as well, it does make it a tough road for them to win. Though Gura's role in this episode still ends up being pretty fun, with Sangmin pointing out his tell of Gura constantly talking as if he was a zombie, and we do get a humorous montage of that, and here we do also see Gura instantly touch with Sungyu and Sangmin, with Sungyu getting funny content about being scared to do so, but also we do see Sangmin himself touching with Gura as well, only then to use his cure immediately afterwards, which in itself also felt like a tell for Gura of like, why is he so willing to touch with everyone right away? Though interestingly, we do see Sungyu telling the others that he didn't take his cure, only for the results of the first round to come in and it be revealed that there are only 2 zombies, now making the other zombie a bit more up for grabs, with Gura claiming that he took his cure and even shows the other players his empty vial, now making it look like Sungyu or Yoonji might be the other zombie. Though following this, we do get a humorous scene continuing off of Changyop and Jungmoon's relationship, with him lying to her about not taking his cure, and in turn she reveals to him that she is a zombie, now thinking that he is her partner, which he later goes and spreads to everybody, which ends up being a pretty poor read from Jungmoon here, in not recognizing that he's lying to her here, but this confusion does lead to a fun reveal after round 2, where it is now 5 zombies, 5 humans, leading to a flashback reveal that Gura was a zombie all along, but he somehow was able to rope Sungyu into helping him, though in reality it did seem to actually be Sungyu's plan, which I don't fully get why he was doing, as it does lead to his loss, but we do see him taking the cure immediately after touching with Gura, but then swapping vials with Gura to allow Gura to lie about his role and in turn infect people during the second round. But with this reveal here, it is now known that it was Gura all along, which essentially makes it game over for the zombies, especially with the 5 people not currently a zombie being members of a 5-person alliance that was formed by Jinho earlier in the episode, which is the first effective thing we see him pull off all season, where we see him initially create this plan to get them a joint win, with this plan involving him, Kyungran, and Yurim, who were the first to enter for the day, along with Sangmin, though they also later add in Poong as well, where this alliance does end up winning the day here, with their plan ending up going near perfectly from the beginning, where as long as they trust each other and them not being zombies, and through the use of cures, they could easily make it so that they're all tied by the end of the game. However, a complication does arise when they figure out that Sangmin actually is 1 point ahead, which can potentially ruin this plan. That is until Kyungran is the one to create this idea of using cures in a way to manipulate how many points they have, but they still end up being 1 cure short, leading to a fun scene of Sangmin trying to lie to Yoonji about giving her immunity in exchange for a cure, again a deal that he knows he can't live up to, but this is interrupted with Poong revealing that he got a cure somewhere else, leading to Sangmin ditching her mid-negotiation, but then we have Sangmin taking the cure, realizing it isn't a real cure, being a fake Changyop gave to Jungmoon to trick them, which is a fun reveal, leading to the scene from the flashback of Sangmin frantically running around looking for a cure, though really this was always a moot point, as Sangmin could just use his garnets to buy a cure, which Again, I think that aspect of this game is kind of lame, though we do end up finishing the game here without the show showing us if Sangmin was successful in getting a cure, though obviously he was. And through a flashback, we do see Changyop later give him a cure, later give him a real cure, believing that Sangmin would be first and give him immunity, but with the reveal that this ends up being a 5-way tie, this obviously ends up backfiring on him. Not just allowing this 5-way tie for immunity happen here, but also now looking like the reason that the zombies lost for the non-immune players, making him the most likely to be voted into the deathmatch. Though again, realistically, this didn't end up mattering that much, as Changyop really only led to Sangmin being part of this tie, where really the other 4 players were going to be tied anyway. But here the winning group gets to decide on who the loser's going to be, where here we do see them feel the need to try to protect Changyop because of his role in this, which they do so by picking Jungmoon, thinking that there's no way that she would pick Changyop for the deathmatch, only for them to be wrong. And thank God we get the return of Tactical Yutinori here, which is normally boring, but with this Changyop versus Jungmoon dynamic, the show really hams up how this showmance is now going against each other, and we get this really dumb love montage, but Jungmoon eventually wins, with this serving as another fun downfall for a particular player here, that being Changyop, who I remember the first time around watching this season, I found him to be one of the more dull cast members here, one of the more forgettable ones. But on subsequent rewatches, I actually do find Changyop to be one of the more entertaining early boots here, with him actually playing pretty well for a lot of his run, but really does end up making a critical error at the end of this round and how he sets himself up to be the target. But before that, I do think he approached the game in a pretty savvy way, playing the middle between Gura's side and the Kyungran Jinho side of things, kind of being the genius's version of a floater, but one that did so a bit too blatantly, to the point where like at the end here he is being taken out by his own closest ally, which is not a great look. But overall, I think Changyop is probably an underrated player in the grand scheme of things. But now for episode 5, which has a bit of an abnormal start, not having the recap being interspliced with the initial banter as normal, but instead being front-loaded in the episode, and that ends up being because of the normal table being replaced by a betting board, instantly leading to speculation over what that could mean. Obviously indicating this episode's main match, that being Scamming Horse Race, a game where the players are given a different clue on the fixed result of this race, and they must bet on the horses that end up in first or second place, with those 2 horses giving a return based on how many people bet on them. And this is another game that does largely rely on making deals with other players to gather enough information to figure out the right horses, but also, again, it is a game that I do have minor flaws with, largely in the imbalance between clues here, where again, people are randomly distributed their clue, and there are clues that simply just don't help at all, at best nullifying one horse, while there are others that, with the combination of only 1 or 2 clues, it gives you a pretty full picture on what those top horses can be, which adds a level of luck to this game that makes it feel inherently unfair. Though again, if you have the right social connections or deal-making ability, it should be able to counter that disadvantage there. But once again, here we do see the ability to buy additional clues with garnets, with this being the first time it doesn't feel intrusive to the intrigue in the game, with this being more of an individual game, and with this also being a difficult game to cause a tie-in, it does lessen the incentive for bigger alliances, though despite that, we still see the same people working together here, with Gura at this point seeming to be isolated, where we do see him trying to actually work with Jinho, only for him to turn him down, and we do have Gura being visibly frustrated, saying the typical trope of only one of you can win, which seemed to be the point of no return for Gura, where from this point forward, he really just seems completely uninterested in playing the game, leading up to his eventual elimination in the following episode. But also here, Sungyu also gets dejected, leading to him buying a clue with garnets, which finally ends up being that 6 is 6th, which is almost entirely useless, but really a lot of this episode ends up focusing around Sangmin, who ends up being the one who gets the most information across the episode, getting a really good clue on his own right of him knowing the sum of the top 3 numbers, but through him also working alongside Kyungran, who has the clue of that first and second are a higher number than third place. This radically narrows down the number of possibilities here, and again, these are 2 greatly important clues, where most of the other clues end up being pretty minor ones, like 7 is slow, which really plays into the imbalance that the clues have here. But in Sangmin fashion, he hams up this entire episode, playing into this role of this compulsive gambler while the rounds play out. But eventually Sangmin and Sungyu reconvene, which gives Sangmin the last piece of the puzzle in his eyes to believe that the top 3 are 1, 4, and 7, which in turn would mean the top 2 would be 4 and 7, as it can't be 1, which inherently should have been eliminated right away after learning Kyungran's clue, yet for some reason Sangmin and Sungyu both wasted chips on it. But now with Sangmin having all the information, everyone wants to talk to him, and we constantly see him ignoring Yurem, telling her that she won't be in last, which might be relevant later. But eventually towards the end of the game, we see Poong's clue finally come into play, it telling him that the horse in the lead at the end of this round will be the winner, and to everyone's shock, it ends up being 3. Meaning that the combination was 3 and 8, not 4 and 7, ruining everyone's plans here and leading to a lot of confusion on where everyone went wrong here, leading to the big reveal that Yoonji had actually lied about her clue, saying that 4 was faster than 3 when her real clue was a pretty pointless one. Which thank God for Yoonji here, where really if it wasn't for that spicing up this episode, I do feel like this would have been a largely lackluster one in terms of the game itself, though again the cast definitely makes up for it either way. This ends up being the only big game revelation across this episode, but throughout all this chaos, Sangmin still doesn't know that he is wrong, leading to him finally getting to talk with Yurem, where he of course tells her the wrong advice, telling her to go all in on 4, only for Sangmin to learn about the real numbers immediately afterwards, and he takes his frustrations out on Sungyu, saying if only I hadn't met Sungyu, which is funny, but the results of the match end up being extremely close here, where despite Yoonji's move here, she ends up still being tied with Kyungran for most chips on the winning horses, which leads to Kyungran end up winning due to her chips having better odds, while Yurem shockingly ends up in last with literally 0. And here you would expect her to pick Yoonji as the one that created all this chaos, though really I don't know how much Yurem was even in the know of any of that stuff happening, and instead ends up picking Jungmoon for having the most garnets, which ends up being a really lucky break for Yoonji and her making the same style of mistakes as the last few boots, but skating her way through despite that. But here we do learn that the death match will be winning streak once again. Pretty strange considering the low amount of number of players here, which again we'll talk about. But here we see both Kyungran and Sangmin agree to help Yurem for feeling bad about causing her to lose, and also through us getting a lot of focus around Poong trying to extort her for more garnets. The focus on her here made it pretty clear that she was going to win. This eventually leads up to the big twist of the episode, and I guess I should talk about the fact that there was a flash forward in this episode, which I've been neglecting, but through it, we've been seeing that for some reason, the eliminated players will be returning in some fashion. Obviously initially making you think that there might be some sort of buyback, which thankfully they didn't do, but later we do learn that they will instead be part of winning streak, which can be looked at as unfair, as again these are people that are out of the game. Though I actually didn't mind this addition here, especially for it being a one-time thing where it does bring an interesting dynamic to this game, making it also based around how you treated players on their way out, which again adds more social strategy elements to the game that also can lead to some wonky reasoning with people's decisions, with obviously out-of-game influences being a major factor here, though really I don't feel like it had much of an impact here. But a lot of focus here gets put on the Changyap-Jungmoon relationship, which again I don't get why they're so obsessed with this one, but really these returning players end up causing a lot of chaos here and messing with both Yurem and Jungmoon, though they don't actually end up affecting the results here, with even them recognizing that Jungmoon is probably screwed and end up deciding to allow the game to last long enough for Changyap and Jungmoon to face off, because they obviously need to ham that up. Though I do love the editing here of them acting as if Changyap losing to her is this big moment and that she might survive, only for Sangmin to be next and end up beating her anyway. But again, we do lose Jungmoon here, who we for some reason see on Grand Final, but here she was fine. Again, I feel like she was one of these more under-edited figures on this season, not being that present until the last couple episodes, and even then a lot of her content revolved around Changyap. And even then, there was also other reasons why she had to be shown. Things like her being a zombie or her being eliminated here. Again, I just feel like she was okay on this season, though I do think her casting on Grand Final is probably the most questionable one of the bunch, considering how minor of a character she was on this season. But again, she wasn't bad TV. I just feel like in comparison to the rest of the cast, she probably was the least notable of the bunch. Well, that let's jump into episode 6, which starts with Gura entering and sitting alone, which really just exemplifies this entire episode for Gura, seeming to just be completely zoned out of the game and seem to just be awaiting his eventual elimination, with this being the culmination of his rivalries with Jinho and Poong, though dumbly they decide to spoil that right away, right from the beginning, where we get a flash forward before the main match is even announced, showing Gura and Jinho in the death match, which is just really asinine, as it really just takes out all the suspense of this episode from the very beginning. And with how this episode was also portrayed, it made it pretty clear that Gura was nearing his downfall. So again, for me, this is definitely the worst of the flash forwards on this season. Where again, thank God for this cast, where if it wasn't for all these character moments that were happening across this episode, this could have been a terrible episode, but instead it ends up being a pretty solid one despite that major blunder. But here we find out that the main match is Catch the Burglar, another mostly basic game, though one that does feel fundamentally flawed here in that it's almost impossible for the burglar to not end up winning here, where you're essentially just handing out immunity to someone randomly, while also greatly favoring those in the big village, with them having more numbers and also having a greater chance of having the burglar, as the village that contains the burglar after the final round automatically loses, meaning that if you can find out who the burglar is and then send them over in that last round, your side always wins. Now technically there is a point system that allows for there to not be this massive tie between the entire group, though it still really just incentivizes a group to stick together and just send over the burglar at the last second. Though another dumb aspect of this game is the fact that there is no incentive for the burglar to not reveal their identity, as unless both sides agree to not allow the burglar to win, they will almost always win. But despite a lot of logical fallacies in how this game is designed, I found this episode to still be really fun despite that, where again it plays out in a near optimal way here, where we do see Kyungran, Sangmin, and Urem in the small village, where they had already been tight before this round, while the big village includes Yoonji, who had already burnt a lot of her social capital in that previous round, and also Jinho, Poong, and Gura, who obviously have this massive rivalry, causing a fracture within this group from the very beginning, allowing the small village to eventually infiltrate them and take over the game, with Kyungran seeming to be the only one to realize initially the optimal strategy here, with the big village really just being a mess, with them not even realizing, after the initial set of results, that they essentially mean that the burglar is in their own group, to where it has to be the actual burglar in Sungyu that has to point this out to them. So they do proceed to send Sungyu to the small village in the following round, where Sungyu reveals to them that he is the burglar, only for Sangmin to not believe him, being one of the few times that we see Sangmin's inherent read being completely off here, with him still thinking that it's Gura, and in turn Sangmin kicks him out, saying, "Should I call the police?" only for the results to come in and he looks like a complete idiot, where it gets revealed that Sungyu was telling the truth, which again is a humorous scene, but strangely again the big village still doesn't get it here, showing them being completely aloof, and we do get Sungyu mocking them in confessional for not knowing the rules, but this should have been a game-ending move for the small village here, and them failing to strike a deal with the burglar the only time he was sent to the other side, while the other side at this point should know that he is the burglar and should keep him by their side. So again, this should have completely doomed the small village here, but again, the other side just sucks so much that they were able to recover despite this, where we do see Kyungran being sent over and ends up apologizing to Sungyu and getting him on board, and with this fracture between Gura, Jinho, and Poong, they dumbly end up deciding to send Gura instead of Kyungran, which ends up being the death knell for the former big village, with the small village now having the majority on the big village side, with Sungyu siding with Kyungran and Sangmin, to which at this point the former small village had essentially won the game, which again was a fun road to that point, though again one that could have been easily predicted, considering the fact that they already showed that Jinho and Gura ended up losing in that flash forward. But also Gura really just seems to have given up here, allowing Urem to switch sides as well, giving in to the small village at this point, though also here we do get some fun content between Sangmin and Sungyu, with Sangmin apologizing on his knees and having to goad Sungyu to be on his side with garnets, but now the intrigue goes back to the current small village that conveniently contains Jinho, Poong, and Gura, and what ends up being a vote to decide the loser and also who is safe, where Gura initially wants to be the one to go back, as it is his turn, though Jinho and Poong want to decide it by rock, paper, scissors, which ends up insulting Gura, where he calls it embarrassing and cowardly, which I really, I think this just fully shows you Gura's ego here, but we do see Poong win the rock, paper, scissors, and in turn perfectly sets up this Jinho-Gura death match, with Jinho being declared the loser and obviously picking Gura, leading to this nice culmination to their rivalry though again, just wish it wasn't so foreshown. But here we do get the first appearance of Indian poker as a deathmatch, a really iconic one for the show, the one I'm a bit mixed on. I do think in this instance, it leads to pretty decent TV, being this grand battle between these two rivals. But beyond this, I do think there are many instances of Indian poker that really just kind of drag on. While the show tries to make it extremely climatic through showing highlights of the relationship between the two people there, or through its really strong use of music throughout it, to me it still ends up being a bit slow at points. Though here we do get a lot of close calls for Jinho, with him barely edging out Gura, typically by 1 point. Though we do learn about Jinho's counting of cards that works to his advantage here, allowing him to win the match. Being this big moment for Jinho in this season that really propels him to his eventual win, being the first time you actually look at Jinho as this big threat in the game. But obviously here we lose Gura, who is really just an incredible character on this season, being one that takes control of most situations that he's in, particularly early on in the game, where he forms this majority alliance in the first 2 episodes. And despite the game later flipping on him, he was still in a position where people feared him in the game and didn't want to go against him. So again, Gura has a massive presence across the first half of the season, with him being the source of a lot of drama on this season, a lot of the banter, and really just a lot of the strong strategic play, particularly very early on. Though again, it does feel like he largely gave up by the end of it. But even then, grumpy Gura was still fun to watch. So again, while I don't find him to be a likable person on this show, I did still find him to be a pretty fun TV personality. But now for episode 7, an episode that contains one of the series' most iconic moments, and ends up being this massive standout episode for Jinho, making him the genius icon that he's known as, and leading up to his eventual win. But we do start off the episode with Jinho and Poong now being looked at as the big targets, after being looked at as the ones to take out Gura, and probably would have been easy targets for this round had this episode contained a more social strategy based element into it, though instead it ends up having a main match that can be played entirely on their own. But here we do get this episode's flash forward, which thankfully they were able to hold some restraint here in how instead of using Jinho's big moment, they end up using a pretty irrelevant moment involving Yurim freaking out over needing a specific card that ends up working out for her anyway. Here we do learn about the 7th main match, in that being Open Pass, a game where everyone receives 20 cards containing numbers and symbols, and they have to create an equation by picking cards out when they're flipped upside down through saying open or pass, and the equation that produces the biggest number ends up being the winner. With this feeling like a game of luck initially, with there not seeming to be a clear indicator of how to determine what cards are which, but the players figuring out this game as it goes along is one of the more interesting aspects of watching this main match here, where instantly we do see Sangmin gathering everybody but Jinho and Poong to team up and buy extra packs, with the acknowledgement that they need more multiplication cards, which seems to be the base level strat for this game, and that everyone ends up buying these 3 garnet packs, which ends up including these hide numbers and multiplication cards. Which I will say is probably one of the minor criticisms of this game, in that yes, we do see Jinho figure out the trick of this game, but it's still a game that forces you to buy additional packs in order to win, meaning that you need to have at least 3+ garnets coming into this round, which everyone did here, but that's not always a guarantee. But again, it works out here where both Jinho and Poong have a lot of garnets to work with, despite being on the outs, though we do get some fun from the majority trying to hide their discoveries from Poong and Jinho, where here we see Sangmin blocking the door as Jinho tries to walk in, and we later see Sangmin wasting Jinho's time by telling him a story about a concert of his while his alliance gets their decks together, and all of this is pretty fun. But the context of this makes it even funnier, where we later find out that obviously Jinho knows more than any of them do. But eventually we do see Sungyu buying a 2 garnet pack, which is where we learn the first trick of this game, in that the cards from these different packs have different colored backs, where if organized correctly, this will obviously help you determine which cards are which. But to get enough of these good cards, it would still take a good chunk of garnets, so this definitely still leaves some room for variance here. But here also we get a funny scene of Sungyu trying to hide his secret from his own alliance, with him playing off how bad the 2 garnet pack is, only for Yoonji to call out the red backs, which kind of starts this Sungyu Yoonji rivalry that gets played up. Through this, we do get a funny confessional from Sungyu asking what sign is she because he doesn't get along with Aries. But coming into the decisive round, we do see the majority still scrambling, not even having enough cards between them to optimize their decks, really showing you how difficult it is to do here, where again, this was a majority alliance of 5 people who all struggled to get an optimal combination, but conveniently we do have the play order here contain the majority alliance going all in a row first, and it is here when Jinho notices for the first time that there were even red cards in the game, which again, we will find out doesn't matter to him. But I do love how much this episode tries to paint Jinho as clueless before his eventual reveal. But here we do see Kyungran take the initial lead, with Sangmin seeming to have the best deck of the bunch, but gets screwed over by a lot of low numbers. Sungyu gets screwed over by his 1+ sign that he mixed in there and ends up getting the lowest score up to this point. Ironic considering he is the one that initially find the trick that this group is using, but this section culminates with Yurim's run where, as seen in the flash forward, she obviously struggles here, though she does barely edge out Sungyu with her having this massive reaction to this, which did feel kind of OTT, but then we get to Jinho, who initially seems to have this random mix of cards, and we see the other players mocking his deck, but then he starts and shockingly gets the perfect combination of times and high numbers, which gives us one of the most iconic moments of the series, in that we get this flashback here with Jinho figuring out something that no one else was able to do, where he sees that the cards with symbols and the cards with numbers have different card designs, with it being a really minute difference that 100% I don't think I would have gotten, where the design of the cards with symbols are upside down, which again, through this allows Jinho to end up winning this, and really this ends up being his most notable moment across his 3 seasons, and also a moment that really exemplifies the genius in showing that there's always a way to game the game. But strangely, this isn't the end of the main match here, where we do still have to go to Poong, who you would have expected Jinho to try to help out here, but instead Poong decides to just leave it up to chance, not figuring out much of anything, which miraculously leads to him tying Sungyu for last here, now giving Jinho the choice between Poong and Sungyu on who to save, and shockingly he does save Sungyu, which really comes out of left field, with Jinho and Poong being extremely close up to this point, though Poong seemed pretty resolute in going into the deathmatch here. And he was talking about how he's a ray of dead man walking, and again, this felt like another situation of Poong just seeming to give up here, but I do find this to be a pretty questionable move from Jinho, with him doing this because he's worried about the target on their backs as a duo, which, I mean, if this was a social strategy game, I would say all around this is just a bad move. Though considering how close we are to the end game, and again in the game that is more competition based, where having alliances aren't as useful, especially towards the tail end of the game here, and also with Sungyu later paying him back anyway, I mean this probably does work out to his benefit. But here we do see Poong really hamming up his choice here, with him walking around and saying he's going to touch the shoulder of the person he's going to pick, and he ends up picking Yoonji only for her to say no, and then Poong tries to pretend like he doesn't know what he's going to do, but really the choice does go through, and we do get the return of Indian poker, which, I mean, this was not the most interesting of matchups here, though Yoonji didn't seem to know how to play at all, but still ends up winning against Poong here, who ends up calling one of Yoonji's all-ins pretty early on, leading to his loss, and Poong was great TV across this season, being the center of drama early on in the season, with his flip against Gura, and him seeming to be the most invested in trying to get a number of garnets, where we constantly see him trying to make deals for garnets whenever he has leverage, but even beyond that, we do get some fun character moments from him, and he did seem to play pretty well up until his last couple rounds, where he was always in the know and somehow ended up being on the winning side of those first 4 main matches. But it is in this game that he really just seemed resigned, to where I wouldn't be surprised if this was just another Gura situation of him just not feeling the game anymore, but that doesn't change the fact that he was still a pretty major character up to that point. But now for episode 8, which I remember not liking this episode the first time I watched the show, though I really don't know why, as it ends up containing an extremely strong main match, and while the death match is one that is kind of convoluted, it does still lead to interesting TV. The episode does start with Jinho and Sungyu being the first to enter, where they solidify an alliance that doesn't really last beyond this one episode, but also here we do get a lot of focus around the Sungyu-Yoonji rivalry, with this playing a major factor into the episode, with him ironically saying that he wants to stay far away from Yoonji, only for him to be placed on a team with her. But also interestingly here, this is the first episode where we hear the cast talking about the airing of the show. Again, bringing this interesting dynamic that the show brings here, and them being able to reference the actual episodes by this point in the season, and with this also being the point in the season where the season has already concluded filming by the time this episode airs, it also means that the editors have an idea of who's going to win at this point, to where they can start to set that up. And again, I do feel like Jinho's Dodo edit really does stop from this point forward, despite him having instances where he does get outplayed in these last few episodes. Also here we do see the flash forward, which ends up being another nicely balanced one in it, showing Sangmin and Sungyu arguing with the assumption that Sungyu is going to the deathmatch, though we obviously end up seeing that that's not the case. So I did feel like this flash forward was used effectively in how it doesn't spoil anything and actually does mislead you into thinking an opposite result happens. But then we get to the introduction to the 8th main match, one that is extremely simple but so perfect, and that is Kong's Dilemma, a game where they are split into 2 teams and have 10 Kongs or beans for each player, and every round each player can decide on how many Kongs to spend, with the team that spends the most Kongs getting a point, with this being a best of 5. This game does still incentivize individual play, especially if you don't trust your own teammates, as the winner is the person that has the most Kongs remaining of the winning team, with the loser being the one with the least amount of Kongs on the losing team. Again, a simple premise here, but a near perfect game to watch in execution, and we do see the teams being split in a way that really maximizes chaos here, with Yoonji and Sungyu being together alongside Kyungran, who ends up being separated from her closer allies in Sangmin and Urim, who are on a team with Jinho, but also with Sangmin being on a team where his closest allies are on the other side, and also him being Sangmin. This ends up leading to a lot of fun here early on, with him making a deal with the other side and leaking information to them, which usually with a genius you would think that they would leave this reveal for later, masking Sangmin's flip, though with a number of twists and turns in this episode it does allow them to reveal this early here, and instead us getting a major focus on watching Sangmin's actions across the episode. And again, it is fun to see Sangmin mislead his own group here, and we see him proceeding to signal over to the others about how much they should put in, though also here we do see Sangmin not putting in any Kongs himself, despite his claims to be doing so, putting him in a good position to be safe initially if his side loses. Though eventually we do see him just admit this to his group after the first round, which I really don't understand why, as all this does is really just alert your side to your betrayal, making it more likely they're going to pick you for the death match. But again, this adds to the great TV that Sangmin brings here, and this all ends up working out to his benefit, with his side for some reason now trusting him to try to flip over Sungyu, which makes it now look like Sangmin is spying on both sides for the other side's benefit. But again, like through these rounds here, we see the ins and outs of Sangmin's role in this game, with him trying to play both sides and waste their Kongs while he himself is not putting in any. And we later learn that Sungyu has also done the same, with him having made a deal with Sangmin to have Sungyu betray his group to give immunity to Sangmin. Though we do see a lot of distrust growing between the two, that culminates here at the end of the game, where Sangmin decides to betray Sungyu, with him now fully flipping back to his OG group, with him obviously having a massive advantage there if his group were to win. And again, all this flip-flopping from Sangmin really just elevates this game beyond the more basic mind game that it could have been. But a mistake that Sangmin does make here is giving the other side 2 wins first, as in doing so he leaves it open for the other teams to now just go all in, whereby doing so they end up winning this round and in turn the game anyway. Though here they do have the plan to create a 3-way tie between them, so that they can get a joint win, only for us to get the final reveal of the game in that Sungyu, not trusting his team, actually held back 1 Kong, being declared the sole winner, and we get this great reaction from Yoonji with her standing next to him being blindsided here. And we do get Urim and Jinho being tied for last, with Sangmin holding back, leading to him not going in directly, but Sungyu ends up holding up to his deal with Jinho and picking Urim for the death match, and also ends up giving Jinho immunity with the intention of wanting Sangmin to be picked for betraying him, only for Urim to pick Yoonji instead, blindsiding Sungyu in this position. And really, this entire segment is pretty great, with no one really getting their way in this situation, and everyone getting blindsided to some degree by these results. But the deathmatch ends up being one that is one and done, and that is the Image game, a game that I just find extremely convoluted, but also one that ends up being broken, with the players gaming this in a way that feels like the producers didn't even intend on it being played this way. Now, it is meant to be a game of reading your opponent's thoughts through guessing the image that they picked, but here we do have everyone participating in the game, as the goal here is to not have everyone get your image correctly, but not to have everyone get it wrong either, which again convolutes this to a degree that I personally don't enjoy, but also ends up adding this social strategy element to this game as well, with these other players being able to help you out. Though really the seat order plays a major factor in this, as we later see the players secretly signaling to each other what to do, where we do see Yoonji saying phrases that have nothing to do with her image, but somehow Sungyu is getting it right, revealing that Yoonji had gamed this beforehand, working with Sungyu feeling bad for how he screwed her over, and this is giving Sungyu the answers, which does feel like an oversight in the rules. I do feel like shouldn't have been allowed, but it does go through here, and later we do find out that Sangmin was also in on this plan as a way to rebuild trust with Sungyu, and he is meant to vote the opposite of what Sungyu does to guarantee Yoonji doesn't lose points along the way, essentially breaking the game and just completely outplaying Urim here. But even beyond that, this game does go on for quite a while, with it being pretty clear that Urim was going to lose, with her clearly talking as if she lost in her confessionals, and we even see her decide to double the penalties just to get the game over with. But there is a point where the game actually does become even again, though again that really just ends up dragging this out even more. And again, while there are fun reveals here and there throughout this death match, I do feel like the segment as a whole just kind of drags. But again, through this we do lose Urim, who after Jungmoon is probably the next least notable figure on this cast, where she did seem to be a bit behind strategically at every step, though she did seem to be good enough socially to where she survived 2 games of winning streak and did have some solid allies at points. Though again, not a player I would have much confidence in to really make her own path in a game. I mean, I just don't think she's really able to comprehend a lot of the games on this season, and seeing her struggling constantly in the main matches, from election game, the scamming horse race, the open pass, I mean, she just didn't seem to have her finger on the pulse. So despite her having a deep run here, I never really got the sense that she was the greatest player. But now let's jump into episode 9, which does start off with a pretty funny exchange. I mean, literally, as we do see Yoonji coming in first with Sungyu and Sangmin, to where now they want garnets in exchange for helping her out. And we do see Yoonji having a whopping 30 garnets, which felt unprecedented at this point. But we do see this debate between Sungyu and Sangmin over who's more important to her win, and later after Jinho enters, we see him trying to get garnets back from the ones that he gave to Urim, which doesn't go too well for him. But also here we get this funny moment of Sungyu leaving his garnets behind and Sangmin contemplating doing something with them, only to back out of it. But here we also get the flash forward for the episode, that being another one that's kind of irrelevant, of just showing Yoonji and Sungyu in a bidding war, which, I mean, again, really, who cares? But here we do learn that the 9th main match ends up being Expression Auction, which the use of an auction main match ends up being a staple on every season of the show, and I really do enjoy every iteration of them, though this one is clearly the most basic and also the most broken of them, where they are given 10 blocks of ascending value to buy the right numbers and symbols to end up making an equation that equals 10. Though a really fun aspect of all this is that there is a rule that ties in bidding lead to the tiles for auction being discarded, which leads to numerous fun reactions along the way. But right away we do see everyone get a number tile, with the exception of Jinho, who Sungyu goes out of his way to block him here, kind of abruptly ending the Jinho-Sungyu alliance. But eventually Jinho is forced to use a 10 to get his number tile so that he isn't auto-eliminated here, which I will say that is an aspect of this version of the game that I think is kind of lame. Where even there, someone could have easily just used their 10 to knock out Jinho from the beginning here, though it seemed like they ended up taking pity on him. But funnily here we do also get a fun moment of Sangmin in what could have been a losing move for him, try to goad people into trying to take the plus, only for him to be the only person that ends up bidding on it, and in turn gets stuck with a near unwinnable situation. Well, here we also see Sangmin and Sungyu reconcile, with Sangmin agreeing to help Sungyu win by using his tiles to up the bidding and block others out, so that Sungyu can give him immunity. But this is where we learn about the special auction, which ends up being an auction using garnets for an 11 cube. A cube that can buy anything automatically, which I will say is another lame aspect of this auction, where if you have a number at this point in the game, the 11 cube is essentially an auto win, where all you have to do is block everyone else on the way to that combination, and then you just use your 11 at that point, automatically winning the game. Again, that's an aspect of this auction that I do think is a bit broken, though this is also where we do see the Sungyu Yoonji bidding war that strangely Yoonji kind of just gives up on, where considering the importance of this cube and the fact that she later gets eliminated, you would think she would try a bit more, but Sungyu ends up winning it, and at this point, with Sangmin backing him, he essentially is guaranteed the win as long as they play their roles, though even then we do get some intrigue here from Sungyu trying to rope Jinho back in and essentially make him the same deal that he made with Sangmin, only for Jinho to work against him here in making a deal with Kyungran. So we have this moment where Kyungran is about to win, and Jinho then pretends to bid, obviously just pretending to stop her, and we get this big reveal flashback here, only for Sungyu to then block her anyway. And this is also followed up by Sangmin blocking out Jinho to guarantee his loss here as well, but eventually Sungyu ends up using his 11 cube to win the match and save Sangmin as expected, though he does fake him out here and pretending to pick Kyungran first. But this leads to Jinho making the easy choice here and picking Yoonji over Kyungran, especially considering he talked about wanting revenge for Poong and Urim, also him just having worked with Kyungran. But this ends up being Yoonji's third time in the deathmatch in a row, but is also ending up being her last time, with her facing off against Jinho in Indian poker. Though they do make an addition here in that each player is able to see the opinions of the other players, though they will remain anonymous, once again adding a social strategy aspect to the game. And in turn, we strangely see the divide go down in gender lines, and I really don't understand why fully. Now, technically, Sungyu never learned of Jinho's betrayal, and also Sangmin didn't have that much of a connection to Yoonji, so it's like, okay, I guess they can side with Jinho, but Kyungran not siding with him did feel a bit weird, considering obviously she just worked with Jinho in the main match, but also, like, all this is weird, considering these are literally the exact opposite delineations that we had in the previous death match, where Sangmin and Sungyu were backing Yoonji, while Jinho and Kyungran were on the same side together. So again, just kind of weird how this broke down. But either way, here we do see Sungyu and Sangmin do effective work in creating a plan to split their votes all the time in order to confuse Yoonji, though through doing so, Kyungran creates a plan to counter it, but ends up being extremely convoluted to where both of them end up forgetting it midway through, leading to Yoonji making a number of incorrect calls and end up losing the match here. Also, something to note is the fact that this episode also contains a flash forward towards the end of the episode that essentially acts as a next time on, with this showing us the comedian Haha in the game, which is kind of confusing without context. Obviously that gets explained in the next episode, though again, interesting of them to include that in the middle of this episode here. But either way, we do end up losing Yoonji, who, while I don't think she's the most memorable Genius player in the world, I do think she's probably up there with the more underrated ones, where I think her biggest issue is that she obviously struggled to keep a solid alliance, and to be fair, part of that comes from her betraying everyone earlier. That kind of ruined her reputation, but she does have some pretty savvy plays across this season, and despite lacking a solid ally, she did still find herself within the majority at points. I mean, I don't think there's a single round in this season that she plays particularly poorly, though obviously there are numerous points where she does get outplayed, though she does also have 2 deathmatch wins under her belt, with her completely gaming the image game in a way that I think is completely unprecedented. So again, I do think overall she is a solid player, and to me she is one of the bigger snubs from grand final. But now let's jump into episode 10, an episode I remembered hating the first time I watched it, with it being the longest episode of the season, being a near full hour and a half. And while it's still not my favorite now, I do enjoy it more so for what it is, and what it is the first ever guest round, where this becomes a tradition for following seasons, in that during this round, every player gets to invite a guest that will help them through this day's worth of matches. For the most part, I will say I never loved the guest round. rounds. I always found them to kind of mess with the dynamic of the show that we've come to know, making the episodes not focus as much on the actual cast that we know, and more so focusing around these guests that can be a bit of a mixed bag in terms of entertainment. And every time we see guests, I always just kind of preferred that we had a more standard round. But the episode here does start with the front-loaded recap, but also along with that, strangely, a recap of the Final Four's games up to this point, which felt very weirdly placed here, though through this, we do strangely get Sangmin being credited for the zombie game joint win, which I found bizarre, considering I felt like that was more so Jinho and Kyungran's doing. But also here we do get talk about Jinho overcoming his second place curse, which again felt like clear foreshadowing. But then we see the players recruiting their guests in the outside world, which felt weird to see these players outside of the Genius set. But then we see the players and their partners entering the set one by one, starting off with Sangmin, who is joined by his partner Haha, who gets the biggest focus out of the guests here, with him being an actual celebrity and again being promoted in that flash forward in the last episode, seeming like a big deal and a big get for the show here, and one that I do wish we got to see play a full season, considering the fact that he seemed to be a competent player, though that obviously never comes to be. Then we see Kyungran enter with her partner Kyunghyun, who was just kind of boring, though he does come off as a pretty savvy player in his own right, being the reason why Kyungran ends up surviving this round. But here we also get an awkward interaction with him after he reveals that he is an English teacher, only for us to learn that Sangmin lived in America for 8 months, saying that he knows some English, which is followed by some of the most broken English I've ever heard in my entire life, with him saying, "How about feel?" But then we see Sungyu and CEO Lee enter, the CEO of his music company, which is just so weird, where Sungyu essentially just brings in his boss, but CEO Lee just sucks here. Being a major reason for Sungyu's downfall, though that in itself does lead to some humor here. Though through this, we do also hear about Sungyu wanting to target Kyungran because she is the scariest person he has met since his father, which is a funny line. Also here, we do find out that Sungyu still hasn't followed Sangmin back on Twitter, which I think kind of shows you who's more invested in this relationship. But then we do meet Jinho's partner, Yeonyul, who is a fellow professional gamer, and seemed to be a big one with Sungyu talking about him and his sister being fans of his, but really he just ends up being kind of just another version of Jinho, of them seeming intelligent, though making a lot of questionable decisions along the way. Now here we also end up getting the flash forward of Sungyu throwing something across the room to Sangmin, which again feels like a pretty unnecessary one here, though largely inoffensive. But before the reveal of the main match, we have the players being sent to their individual rooms, where conveniently Sungyu and Sangmin are right across the hall from each other. But here we find out that the main match is going to be Confined Scamming Horse Race, a modification of Scamming Horse Race from episode 5, which strangely seemed to have just aired at the time of this filming. Though here the game is played with the 4 players being confined inside their rooms, to which their guests are the ones doing the communication and doing the betting. And straight up, I didn't find this to be as entertaining as the original, where unlike that one, there are no twists and turns here. The game plays out in a mostly baseline way, one of the few times the entire season that occurs. Though interestingly here, we do see that there are 2 winners for this match, with the top 2 getting immunity, though obviously if a guest ends up winning one of them, they end up giving immunity to their partner, which I'm mostly fine with, though I do think this takes away agency from the players to decide who their deathmatch opponent is going to be, as obviously with 2 people having immunity, that essentially means that the 2 people without immunity automatically go into the deathmatch, which does take away from the social strategy aspects of the game, though not really a major deal. But again, most of the entertainment here does come from the guests messing up and their partners being frustrated at them. But at the same time, again, I don't like how this takes away agency from the player, with them potentially being screwed over by decisions made by their partner when we're all the way at the final 4. But very early on, the show gives you all the clues and essentially tells you what the top 2 are, with the players themselves knowing it as well, which leads to, again, the game playing out in a pretty boring way, though we do get a number of fun interactions here, like this Sungyu Yeonyul interaction of Sungyu claiming that he's his hero, only to then say that doesn't carry over into the Genius. And then we have Yeonyul pretending to be a fan of Sungyu's, only for him to not be able to name a single song of his, We didn't have Jinho telling Young Yul to make a deal with Sungyu and just to barge in and be brazen, only for him to walk in and be told to leave and do so right away. We also get Haha and Sangmin pretending to be upset at each other to fake out the other players while they're betting, and that's a pretty fun strategy. But right away we do get a lot of worrying signs about CEO Lee, with Sungyu telling him that we need to come up with a strategy, like when you're producing, only for him to then reveal that there is no strategy. And really he seemed to be unwilling to follow orders here, which, to be fair, would be their dynamic outside of the show, but within the show, it does lead to him really messing up Sungyu's game here, where we do see him trying to fake out the other teams by placing useless bets that really just ends up wasting chips when they know the horses they need to be betting on. And also Kyungran has a clue that directly opposes the horse that they're betting on, which makes all this entirely pointless, outside the fact that Young Yul ends up actually falling for this, which leads to Jinho's frustration. But this doesn't even benefit them that much to be making this move here. But again, this doesn't really even benefit Sungyu to be making this move here, as even if they were successful in this, in getting other people to waste their chips, they are also themselves wasting chips here as well. But also here we get a lot of garnets being spent on clues, particularly from Sungyu, which is ironic considering his poor placement here. Though finally we have Sangmin being able to figure out the horses without any extra hints, to which the narrator even mocks him for having leaps in logic, and he does actually end up getting a number wrong, but he's able to recover from that anyway. But here we also see Kyunghyun doing a really effective job at just following the leaders, and while Kyungran gets upset at him for doing so, it is actually what ends up leading to Kyungran getting immunity this round, which again makes it feel like she gets saved by complete accident here. But towards the end of this round, we do get the scene that the flash forward alluded to which it's really a nothing game moment, but a really fun farewell scene between Sangmin and Sungyu, with this being the last scene focused around them, of Sungyu making a letter for Sangmin and tossing it across the hall, which technically shouldn't be allowed. This is technical communication, but it does make for funny TV, with Sungyu saying that he will always support him and love him, which I don't think that really stuck. But this is only for Sangmin to respond by complaining that the letter is too light, leading to Sungyu sending him more garnets, though again, this really doesn't amount to much. But here we do see Sangmin winning alongside Kyunghyun, meaning that Jinho and Sungyu are automatically going to a deathmatch, which thank God we get the return of Tactical Yunori. And this is just so boring, it goes on forever, and they really try to ham up this Jinho-Sungyu relationship, which again has never been that interesting, and really I just feel like they spent so much time in this already really lengthy episode on this, all for it to anticlimactically end with a Jinho victory, being an underwhelming exit for Sungyu here. And again, Sungyu is such a star on this season, easily being the best confessionalist on the season, and while confessionals aren't that prominent on this show outside of death matches and flashbacks, many of the more normal confessionals did seem to come from Sungyu and his biting and witty remarks, and to go along with how great of a character he is, he also ends up being a really great player as well. While having missteps here and there, I do think Sungyu is one of the better players to ever play the genius, undeniably to me being the best one-time player and one of the best non-winning players. And really his boot here is partially attributed to the poor gameplay of his partner and him not listening to Sungyu's advice. So again, I really do feel like he was a massive highlight on this season. Again, he had witty confessionals, he had an individualistic gameplay style, he had this great relationship with Sangmin, and all this came from a pop star who clearly had other things going on in his life, to where I'm just surprised by the amount of commitment that he put into this experience, both in terms of his gameplay, but also the entertainment he brought, which again was such a pleasant surprise and is part of what makes the season as great as it is. But now for episode 11, the final 3 episode, which you would think on paper would be boring to have an episode with just 3 people in it. But in every season of the show, they end up adding in guests, whether that be former players or random NPCs to shake up the format, which this episode contains the latter, though I never found it to be as intrusive as the previous episode, as the bulk of the content here still does revolve around the main players' interactions with these people, where here we do see 10 people enter the sets and they are given 1 hour to talk, being able to speak freely without knowing what the main match is going to be. But here we end up getting a lot of focus around this one specific girl that is a race model, that they bizarrely play this So Sexy song every time she gets on screen, which just feels so weird. But also here we do have the guests messing around with the players as well, with them not directly answering some of their questions, which is where we find out that The ground rules that they are given here are for them to not answer questions when there are more than 3 people in the room, which I guess is supposed to force these players to be more active in them getting this information, and also it avoids all the guests and players clumping together, though I don't know if this was entirely necessary as a rule, but this does lead us to the flash forward, which strangely shows Sangmin grabbing the so sexy girl and pulling her away from the group, which is kind of a weird clip without context. But then we do learn that the main match is the 5-5 game, a pretty simple game, one where you have to create questions that will lead to 5 of the guests saying yes and 5 of them saying no. Though interestingly, they are given a character limit on how long the questions can be, though it is tough to follow here for someone that doesn't know the Korean language, though realistically it's never too bothersome here. But here we learn that there will be 2 rounds, with the first occurring now with no additional time for them to get info, while the second round will take place after another period of discussion time. Obviously, those with the most correct answers end up winning, and the problem I have with this main match is that it's extremely easy to tie this, which doesn't end up happening here, but I do feel like they were very lucky in the fact it doesn't happen here. And while, yeah, obviously they can just have a tiebreaker, which I will assume would be them just making questions until someone gets it wrong eventually, but if it's just the same thing over and over again, again, I feel like it's still going to go on for forever. So thankfully we don't end up seeing it here, but then we get to the first questions where Kyungran instantly figures out the basic strategy for this comp in using OR questions to artificially get your questions up to 5, which ends up being effective for her, except for one question where she asks about birthdays. And it's really not her fault here for getting this wrong, where it really just feels like human error of the guests not giving her the proper information when she asks for it, which is kind of BS, where she does ask her earlier in the round about her birthday, and the woman gives her her resident number instead of her actual birthday, which just seems kind of dumb. Now, I don't know Korean culture well enough to know if this is just a common thing people do when someone asks you for your birthday, but again, why wouldn't you just say the day that you were born? Especially because later we see Jinho having asked her the exact same question and getting it right, because she for some reason told him her real birthday. So again, all this feels really dumb, but really we do see Sangmin struggle here with him getting 2 of his questions wrong as opposed to the others who only get 1. With him literally saying that he knows that his questions have at least 4, but is hoping for 1 more, which is just a really dumb strategy. But eventually we get to the additional discussion time where they're given 10 more minutes to talk, and this ends up being a really fun scramble, seeing everyone running around, asking random questions, though the true events of this sequence aren't revealed until later flashbacks. And realistically, this actually makes the game a bit too easy, where everyone here does end up being perfect outside of one from a human error, which again makes them lucky that they just didn't get a tie here. But first we get Kyungran, who ends up playing this pretty baseline here, continuing off of her previous strategy, though now with more information, though once again gets screwed over here by human error of a person not understanding her question, which ends up leading to Kyungran's loss here. But then we get to Sangmin, which starts with him instantly observing that half of the group is crossing their legs right now, which he ends up effectively using that as a question. And we also get this funny moment of him being told to rewrite his question because he doesn't know how to phrase it. But this is where we do wrap up the lead up to that flash forward, where now we get a flashback showing Sangmin giving the so sexy girl a bracelet in order to inflate the number of people with bracelets to 5. At the time, seeming like a really impressive strategy for him to artificially add to the initial number, though it just gets one-upped when we get to Jinho, where we get another great moment of Jinho completely figuring out this game. And I do love the lead up to this, where we do get this montage first of the guests talking about who they're rooting for, leading to all of them saying that they are rooting for Jinho because they think he's the best player there and the one of the most understanding of this game, which is where we find out that Jinho has fully gamed this game by realizing that he can create his own information. So he ends up touching people with the back of his hand, and he tells them his brother's name, all this to create unique information that he knows only 5 people know. Again, being this great moment for Jinho here, which essentially ends up winning him the main match. And with him going into the final against 2 untested players in death matches, it really makes Jinho the front runner to win at this point. But with Jinho's win here, this means that Kyungran and Sangmin are automatically sent to the death match, which ends up being Same Picture Hunt, a pretty notable death match, with it later being reused in future seasons, and also later getting a modified version that's used multiple times, but this ends up being its first iteration, and it being a mostly basic game of memory, with them being given a board of 16 letters, and behind each of those letters are symbols that they have to memorize, to where they are given a conveyor with the respective symbols that they need to find, and it really is just a back and forth on who can remember the right symbols at the right times, with the first to get enough wrong for their face tile to drop ends up losing here. And I will say that this ends up really getting dragged out on the show, where that is probably my one criticism of this death match, considering it's really fantastic outside that. But seeing these two face off against each other here, two of the best main match players of the season and two of the closest allies across this season, both of which having avoided the death match the entire season, and seeing them now have the face off against each other was pretty great to watch and does add a lot of emotional weight to this death match. But right away we do see Kyungran taking the advantage, and really Sangmin is never able to catch up, though we do get this pretty miraculous pull from him, setting this up to be his last stand, only for him to immediately lose right afterwards. But what is there to say about Sangmin? Obviously an incredible character, debatably the best reality TV character of all time in my eyes, though that is a status that I feel like grows over his next two appearances, where really outside of the Garnet heist here, I do think his best moments are still to come. But even here, he is just consistently bringing great TV, being an expert at hamming it up for the camera, but not in a way that feels annoying and instead comes off as endearing. And mixing that in with the fact that he is an extremely savvy and self-interested player that takes almost every opportunity to turn against his own alliances to benefit him as an individual, he really makes for perfect casting for a show like The Genius. And again, the best is yet to come, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But with that brings us to the finale, which does give us this over-dramatic intro with lights turning on, the show Jinho and Kyungran standing in the middle of the room, and us getting these flashbacks to their relationship, which does feel forced as their relationship was never that focused on beforehand. But either way, here we do get a flash forward showing Jinho being suckered in by Kyungran during Indian poker, and this was just entirely pointless and just felt like it was here because that's The Genius at this point. But after the intro, we end up seeing the return of the booted players, where they end up having the typical banter you would expect from the beginning of the episode, with Gura still coming off as bitter here, talking about feeling embarrassment to be on a show with Poong and Jinho. But here we learn the role that these players play in the finale, and the fact that there are essentially 12 items that will act as advantages for the finalists here during these final matches, and that each booted player will pick an item and give that to their player of choice, adding a social strategy aspect to the finale of The Genius here, but not in an overwhelming way. Again, this is not Survivor or Big Brother where the entire game is decided by a jury vote, but I do like adding in this aspect of having to maintain your relationships with the people while they were in the game, feeling like the inclusion of skills that would typically benefit you in a main match, now helping you in the final, which ends up being a series of death matches, making this final feel like a satisfying test of skills for the eventual winner, but also does add a level of variance to the game that is not ideal, in the sense that there is this randomness of who gets what skill, which can play a major factor into who wins, though I do feel like they do a decent job at balancing these skills to where none of them come off as that overpowered, so because that ends up rarely making a difference. But here we do see a lot of the earlier boots in Jinsuk, Minseo, Changyap, Jungmoon, and Poong give their votes to Jinho, which the likes of Changyap and Jungmoon do come out of left field here, though I do suspect the fact that I believe the Open Pass episode had just aired at the time of this filming, and probably did boost the level of respect that they had for Jinho, while Kyungran ends up getting the help of Jimmy Cha, Gura as an anti-Jinho vote, Yoonji, and Sangmin, with Sangmin really hamming up his decision as normal. Though an aspect of this vote that I didn't particularly like is the fact that Yurim and Sungyu, who are not able to attend here, are essentially not able to vote, though instead they had assigned someone to vote for them. But doesn't seem like they were given specific instructions on who to vote for, essentially giving those picked here 2 votes, which leads to both of their votes going to Kyungran, though I do question if this is actually how they would have voted. Now, Yurim I do think is a solid Kyungran vote, but Sungyu in particular I feel like probably goes Jinho, though again, I might be wrong, but I did feel like that was kind of a strange choice, though again, not a major deal realistically. And also with there being a leftover item, which goes to the person that has the most garnets, which in itself feels a bit arbitrary, and it does go to Jinho, it ends up being even anyway. So again, definitely not a major deal here. But then we do get to the actual start of the final, where we learn that they are adding 20 garnets to the prize pool, probably because it was already too low, and even despite that, it only ends up being 79 million won, which at the time didn't even amount to 79,000 US dollars, so really not that big of a prize by US standards. But this actually ends up being the largest prize pool for the Genius up until Grand Final, which is pretty insane when you think about how little they're playing for. But here we do get formally introduced to the final format, which again is a best of 3 in a series of death matches, with 2 of them being death matches that had appeared previously, while there's one new one that will always be played second. And again, I do like this format. It feels like the most proper way to conclude a Genius season, though at the same time can lead to an underwhelming outcome if it does end in a 2-0 victory, as it does here. Where here we do learn that the 2 returning games end up being Indian Poker and Same Picture Hunt, probably the best 2 options here, as otherwise I guess you would pick Tactical Nori, which no one wants that. But interestingly, one of the items that Jinho gets is the choice of which game to play first. And with him being a poker player, he unsurprisingly picks Indian Poker, which I'll be honest, I do find this matchup here to be pretty boring, with them really dragging it out as they need to fill out the episode length. And really there was no suspense for me on the eventual Jinho win here, though we do get the moment from the flash forward of Kyungran being annoyed that Jinho isn't looking at her, but again, most of this is just boring. But this brings us to the new game, which is more entertaining, in that being Gil Hap, a pretty iconic Genius game of them getting 9 images that have varying shapes, shape colors, and background colors, and they have to say Hap to find combinations of 3 images that either have all same or all different properties, which will give them a point, though an interesting aspect of this is that saying Gil with no more combos remaining will end the round and give you 3 points. Though I will say I didn't like any of the rules really revolving around Gil here, in that you can't say Gil in the same turn that you say Hap, making it a waiting game for when one of the 2 players give in when they already know that there's only one left, which leads to some wonkiness there. But really the worst rule of the entire game is one that is debatably a game-winning one for Jinho, in that if you incorrectly call a Gil, the question now gets transferred over to the booted players, where if they answer correctly, they get a point for the player they backed, which ends up being extremely overpowered for Jinho here, with his backers including Jeonsuk and Jungmoon, who clearly end up being the most skilled at this. All of Kyungran's backers really suck at this, with Yoonji being the only one to even get 1 point. And is also equally unfair in the fact that less of her backers are actually there in person. Again, to me, this just feels like too much influence from the social strategy aspects of the game. To me, this final, by the time you get to the death matches, should be more focused around how the players themselves are playing. And thankfully, the Genius doesn't make this mistake ever again, though I do think it kind of taints the results of this final to a degree. Even though realistically, I don't think it would have mattered. Where even if Kyungran was going to win Gil Hap without Jinho getting help, I still think Jinho would have still won Same Picture Hunt, considering the fact that he seemed to be very good at that style of memory, and Kyungran was pretty mediocre even in her win against Sangmin. So I do think Jinho had a massive advantage in that game anyway, and also even with Jinho getting help here, he also is losing points by calling an incorrect goal to get that help, meaning that he isn't really gaining many points through this, he's just recovering those that he lost, when if this wasn't a rule, he probably wouldn't have been so open with calling Gil. So while it does help him win here, it's not this clear-cut case that he would have lost without this twist. And at first we do get a pretty fun battle between the 2 here, with the scores remaining pretty close for most of the game, though when the score ends up being 36-28 coming into the final round, and that final round essentially being the easiest round of the bunch, meaning that they're just going to trade points back and forth, it becomes pretty clear that Kyungran had already lost. And while yeah, it would have been great to see this be closer, I do think Jinho winning here is still the most satisfying outcome from a storyline perspective Retrospective for the season, with him having this big underdog run and making these impressive plays, and while that's also backed by an equal amount of bad plays as well, him being the player known for coming in second place and him ending up winning this game is a pretty satisfying outcome for him. But the season does end with a little preview for the following season, recreating the first scene of the show, but with a package being delivered to a new player who gets revealed to be Hung Chul, who I guess is a big deal, someone that we will certainly talk a lot about when I get around to talking about season 2. But with that, let's wrap up the video by talking about the finalists, starting off with Kyungran, who ends up being the only woman to ever make a final in the Genius, and because that she does get this title of the Genius's greatest female player, and I do think she is a very good Genius player, particularly when it comes to main matches, with her skills in building relationships and having solid allies being a massive boon to her, though I do still question how good of a player she really is, where even in those main matches, she does have a pretty rocky track record, to where despite not outright losing any main matches here, she has been blatantly outplayed in a number of situations through this season, though also at the same time does have impressive moments, like her plan to create the tie in the zombie game. But I do very much question her overall deathmatch ability, which I just don't look at as that strong, where at this point she had only beaten Sangmin in Sane Picture Hunt, which she also didn't perform that well in. And really, even then, Sangmin has a bad track record himself in death matches. Though despite that, I mean, she's still up there, certainly, with the best female players in the Genius. Though really, that also just comes down to the fact that there aren't that many good ones, due to the typically uneven gender balance. But again, I'm sounding extremely negative here, but I do think Kyungran is still a very impressive player here. I think she played a very solid game here. I just do wonder if she would ever be able to win a season, considering I do feel like most people would end up outclassing her in most of the death matches in the finale. But with that, I mean, let's talk about the winner of the season in Jinho, who really ends up being the star of the Genius by the end of it, where when you think of the Genius, Jinho is the person who you typically see defining the show, being the show's first winner, but also providing some of the most iconic moments in the history of the show, with the open pass moment, his rivalry with Gura, him gaming the 5-5 game, and considering his love of the show and his constant coming back to play in 3 of the 4 seasons, it really does make him the icon for this show. And he is a great character across this season, again having some dodo moments, but also having some flashes of brilliance, but really comes off as a likable underdog throughout a lot of this season. Though I will say, I do have a bit of a question mark on how good of a player he is, where, again, if someone's saying that he's the best player of all time or something to that nature, I do think he is probably overrated. Though I do think there's also a side of the fan base that underrates Jinho. I mean, to me, I think he is a great Genius player. Definitely the most well-rounded of this season, where while he does get some pretty mixed results in main matches, especially in comparison to the likes of Sangmin and Kyungran, he far exceeds them in death matches, mastering Indian poker on this season, and seems to just have a perpetuity for these one-on-one games, to where while he did have many points in this season where he looked kind of dumb, and those are still knocks against his game for me, I do still think he is a pretty solid all-around player, and further proves that in following seasons, despite those seasons not typically being looked at as strong ones for him. And I do think he sets a strong foundation for his legacy in this season, though I think this is debatably his worst played season of the 3, where he spends a lot of it on the bottom and not really knowing what's going on. And though again, still within that, he does have these great moments with numerous deathmatch wins and some standout main matches, though I do think overall his game ability seems to improve as he continues to play moving forward. But with that, that is the entire season of The Genius, Rules of the Game, a fantastic first season to what ends up being one of my favorite reality shows of all time. But I do think this season does show some growing pains for the series, with certain games not being as well designed as what you would expect from the show later on, and also some questionable production decisions at points, but this still ends up being an all-time great season of reality television for me, having a wide range of iconic moments, from the Garnet heist, to the election game reveal, to the joint win in Zombie Game, to the Jinho-Gura rivalry, to the open pass reveal, to Sungyu's betrayal in Kong's Dilemma, to Jinho's 5-5 game reveal. I mean, there are so many great moments that stem from this season, along with the fact that there's an incredible cast on this season, containing some all-time great characters like Sangmin, Sungyu, Jinho, Kyungran, Yoonji, even Gura, Boong, even Jimmy Cha. This cast is really strong, which ends up being a major reason why this season is as great as it is, and really just ends up being a foundation point for The Genius, where I do think the characters and the level of gameplay just gets better and better from here. Though with this being the first season, I do think this is the one that is looked at as the most iconic of the bunch, though I do think the formula of the show just constantly improves as the series goes on, which I will eventually talk about, where obviously I do have the intention of doing videos like this for the entire series, with my season 2 retrospective probably coming towards the end of the year for its respective 10-year anniversary, and I'll be doing the same things for seasons 3 and 4 down the line, so stay tuned for those. But that ends up being everything I have to say about The Genius rules of the game. Thank you for watching.